Welcome to the National Women's Fitness Academy podcast. We're here to talk about women's health, female hormones, body image, and all things health and fitness.
Hello, girls, and welcome back to another episode of the Women's Fitness Academy's podcast. I'm your host, Siggy, one of the WFA's educators and a women's coach. If you haven't done already, please make sure that you subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss out on another episode, and drop us a review, because with your help, we can reach more women around the world. So please press pause and give us a star review. Today, I'm chatting with a menopause nutritionist, Dr. Jenn Huber. I hope I made that. I hope I pronounced that correctly, who helps women to manage menopause and find body confidence without dieting and food rules. Now, Jenn is a mother. She's also a woman in perimenopause who understands what it's like to be in this stage of life. And through her personal experiences, alongside her training and experience as a doctor and a registered dietitian, you will learn most likely a thing or two today. So buckle up and get ready for the time of your life. Jenn, I want to start today's conversation with asking you, what was the first sign you noticed when you began your perimenopause journey?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I love that question. And as I always say, now that I'm actually postmenopausal, so I crossed the threshold in February of that 12 months without a period, it's always easy to look back in hindsight and say, oh, that was the first sign. But to kind of back things up a little bit, so I'm 46 now, and I was about 37 when I started to go through some perimenopausal changes that took about a year to piece together. So at 37, my children were still quite young. I had 3 kids under the age of 7. I was tired. I was running a practice. I was running a business. I wasn't sleeping well. I was irritable. I was cranky. And everyone was just chalking it up to life and motherhood and stress and being an entrepreneur and, all of the other reasons to explain why these things were happening. And it wasn't until I started to notice changes in my cycle, specifically my cycle started to get shorter. We went on vacation one month and I had 2 periods in a month. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what is this? What is going on? And then I started to notice that I would get hot flashes and night sweats just the day or two before a period started. So when those things started to happen, which was kind of around 38, about a year after I had really been suffering with, waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning for no good reason and feeling exhausted and anxious and irritable. So for me, my first changes were really around mood and sleep, which kind of lines up with the experience that I hear from so many others as well.
It's so interesting that, too often people will say, oh, I'm irritable, I'm angry just because life is hard, I'm taking care of the kids, so forth. But interestingly enough, you also mentioned how you got your period twice in 1 month. Is that something that's very common?
Yeah, and it might be actually helpful to listeners to kind of define the ages and stages a little bit and talking about what happens. So everything from the start of your first period as a young, person, 11, 12, 13, until somewhere usually in your mid to late 30s is what's kind of called the peak reproductive years. And so the late reproductive years overlap with early perimenopause. And in the late reproductive years, you're still having regular cycles. You haven't missed a period. They're still coming within a day or two of when you would expect them to. But maybe you're starting to notice some of these experience changes around mood and sleep and things like that. Once you cross over into early perimenopause, we do start to notice these cycle changes where they're happening 7 days early, 7 days late. But one of the hallmarks of the earliest stages of perimenopause are these cycles that are happening more frequently. And the reason for that is that the follicles that are growing the eggs that usually live for 2 weeks after we've released the egg producing progesterone, they're not as young as they used to be. So they don't produce as much progesterone. So we get more fluctuations in progesterone in early perimenopause, which leads to fluctuations in the length of our cycle, specifically making it more likely that we're going to have shorter cycles and potentially a couple in a shorter period of time.
So in relation to progesterone and someone who is entering that phase of their womanhood, what are some things that could potentially help them help them with that process? Again, like it's something that we need to manage over time without it getting worse.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great question. And not everyone has symptoms related to these fluctuations in progesterone. So this is a normal change experience that is programmed into our DNA. Everyone with ovaries and a uterus goes through this. Not everyone experiences symptoms. Not everyone is bothered by the symptoms that they're having. So with progesterone in particular, it is sometimes used as a prescription in those early stages to help people with sleep, to help people with mood. We're not typically treating the shorter cycles, but sometimes we need to treat the fallout of those shorter cycles, which might be iron deficiency, for example, because if you're having more periods, you're losing more blood. It's harder to stay on top of your iron levels, your B12 levels. So a lot of it isn't managing the process. It's really trying to support people who are going through the process and trying to keep them, as comfortable as they can. And sometimes that does mean hormone therapy. As a naturopathic doctor, there are also, sometimes herbs that we might use, but really a lot of what we're doing, at least what I'm doing, is just trying to educate, people about what exactly is happening, because for so many, they have no idea that they're in perimenopause. And, and we do have some research and data to back that up, that a lot of times people don't even know that they're in perimenopause when they're in it. So they think that something else is wrong, or they worry that they're doing something wrong. And so just by providing that education and saying like, hey, this happens to pretty much everyone, and you're in the age range that it could happen. For most people, perimenopause is going to happen in their 40s, sometimes 50s, and in my case, 30s. So we really need to be, kind of preparing people, I would say, from the age of 35 on. So anybody that I talk to over the age of 35, I'm really making sure that they know kind of the ages and the stages, what to expect, what to look out for, so that, they don't have to suffer, because just because it's normal doesn't mean that we have to suffer, right?
Yes, I totally agree with that, because too often when we're looking at women's hormones, and especially around a period cycles, too often I have women who come to me with PMS or period cramps, and they think they know that it's common, but they don't understand that it's not normal, and it's something that you can manage over time. In regards to those who don't realize they are going through the perimenopause, what are some things that you would help them to be more aware of the symptoms that they're carrying?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question is always around their cycles. Have they noticed any changes in their cycles? So if cycles are still happening regularly, but they're in the age range for when they might fall into that late reproductive stage, so late 30s, early 40s, I might say, are you noticing any changes the week before a cycle starts? Is your PMS getting worse? Are you having more breast tenderness? Are you noticing that you're having these moments of what I call meno rage, where these outbursts of anger and irritability that feel like they're, that they're happening outside of you, like you're looking down on it. You just don't even know where this anger comes from. Are you waking up in the middle of the night? Maybe you're even having a night sweat or two. These would all be, symptoms or signs that would indicate that the hormonal soup, as I call it, is starting to change. If people are having cycle changes that are noticeable by 7 days or more, so a cycle 7 days early, a cycle 7 days late, but they haven't skipped a period yet, they haven't missed a period, that is really defining early perimenopause. And that can last for a few years. This is often the stage that many people will say was the worst. In hindsight, it definitely was the most symptomatic for me in terms of mood and sleep. Hot flashes and night sweats and those symptoms that we really associate with the loss of estrogen or the decline in estrogen happen in later perimenopause and early postmenopause, which can also last a few years. And if you're skipping periods, there's a good chance that you're in that phase.
It's so interesting to have the awareness around this. This is not something that I'm experiencing yet. I'm leading towards my late 30s, but it's always in the back of your mind going, oh, there's all these different symptoms. And my next question regarding this, with the symptoms that you had occurred, did they occur to your mother or to her mother's mothers? Because I've done some research around women's hormones, and there's a lot of meta-analysis going around saying that too often their experiences will also lead to your experience. So if, my mother suffered really bad PMS and went through a horrible phase of like hot flushes and, constant fluctuations of her periods during perimenopause, there may be a chance that I would carry that on as well.
So the research around this is really interesting. So we don't have a great 100% slam dunk way to predict when someone will go into menopause and what their experience will be like. But we do have some pretty good signs and things to look for and correlation. So one is the age at which your mother went into menopause. So in my family, both my mother and my grandmother were menopausal at 44 and 45, and I had my last period at 44. So for me, it was very clear that this was, in my kind of family history. And it was somewhere around 39 or 40 that I asked my mom that question for the very first time. And she said, oh yeah, well, I remember when your grandmother came to visit us, when we just got married, that, she had just gone into menopause. And when we did the math, it was 45. And so, we really were able to see, and I was able to see in hindsight that, okay, this was clearly happening. So obviously I've talked to my daughters about this already so that they kind of have an idea. There is also some research looking at things like hot flashes, so that if your mother experienced a lot of hot flashes, you might be more likely to as well. The more challenging thing about making those predictions is that there are so many things that can influence us after we're born. So yes, we're born with all the eggs that we're going to have. And, there are some in utero influences or obviously genetic influences. But things like stress, illness, smoking, nutrition, all of those things can also influence how many eggs that you have by the time that you get to this age and stage. And so that's why it's difficult to make that 100% prediction. But yes, ask your mothers, your aunts, any kind of older female relatives about their experience, and you might get a hint of what yours might be like.
It's so interesting. And I'm really glad that you opened the conversation around how the genetic side of things is only one aspect, because if someone who's living an unhealthy lifestyle, their symptoms may be worse compared to someone who's, doing the right things by taking care of their health and nutrition. And in regards to that phase of perimenopause and even menopause, like what are some changes in nutrition would you recommend women to make?
Yeah, and this is obviously kind of my little area of expertise and what I love to look into. And so there's two kind of conversations that are happening in parallel. One is, are there any changes and things that we can add in or change that will impact our symptoms? And then the other conversation is, what do we need to be thinking about in terms of the big picture to support our health in postmenopause? So on the symptom side of things, my personal experience was finding a lot of relief in using and including foods that are rich in phytoestrogens. So plant-based estrogen-like compounds that are found in foods like soy and beans and flax and lentils and those kinds of things. And I came to experiment with that and to dig into that research after my own experience of not being able to successfully take hormone therapy. I really wanted it to work, but it just didn't, for lots of reasons we don't need to get into. But when I was still in the throes of having these hot flashes and night sweats, I thought I have to do something. And I had already picked the low-hanging fruit of changing, things like alcohol. I had stopped drinking red wine. I really reduced my alcohol significantly. I was, I was only having 1 cup of coffee. I wasn't having a lot of hot beverages. So I was doing a lot of the kind of low-hanging fruit stuff, but it was really adding in the daily, sometimes twice servings of soy in particular that I noticed dramatic changes in my hot flashes. So this doesn't work for everyone. We don't know why it works really well for some and doesn't work at all for others. But because the foods that provide these phytoestrogens are also really nutrient dense, They're high in fiber. They're usually good sources of protein and other nutrients. There's no harm in trying either. So, this is kind of one of the ways that I love to talk about it, is that there might be some really great benefits to including these foods for some people, but everyone is going to benefit in some way. And there's also some research around diets that are higher in fiber, helping to reduce hot flashes. There's research around the Mediterranean diet and potentially omega-3 fats. So if we're looking at overall patterns of eating that may support some of the symptoms of midlife, including mood and some of the vasomotor symptoms, if somebody's looking for a really general recommendation, you can't go wrong with a Mediterranean style of eating, obviously. We want to stay away from things, though, that potentially increase stress. So I lump things like fasting, restrictive diets, lots of food rules, anything that is potentially going to increase the stress response in the body, either the body or the mind, I really think has the potential to make things worse. And I've seen it make it worse. On the how do we take care of our bodies post-menopause that we're probably going to spend 30 or 40% of our lives in, then it's a bigger question of how do we build these balance plates easily, regularly, without having to think about it all the time. Because as somebody who, I'm an intuitive eating counselor, and I work with people who have been dieting their entire life, and they get to this age and stage and they're like, oh my God, I just want to stop thinking about food. I just want to know that what I'm eating is good for me and is going to help to keep me healthy as long as I possibly can. So we're looking at the really boring, unsexy building a balanced plate with protein, various sources, whatever you like. I think including some plant-based protein has some benefits because it also comes with fiber. It's also lower in they're also lower in saturated fat, obviously, which when we're looking at risks around heart disease in women in postmenopause, that's a real conversation that we're having. But we're just looking at including a variety of foods that give us a bit more protein to help build and maintain muscle, some omega-3s, to potentially help protect our heart and our brain and support our mood. Fiber, always fiber. I think fiber is going to be on my tombstone because fiber is the secret sauce, and you get so much return on investment. Like when we talk about, what can I add in that is really going to do many good things, it's fiber. So fiber can support so many different aspects of our long-term health goals. And just kind of being, I think mindful of our relationship with food, that it doesn't have to be perfect. And most importantly, that not everything can be treated or prevented with food. I think we start to get into some fear around this age where we start to worry about making the right decisions because we don't want something bad to happen, which is fair, right? But because food and movement is just one part, it's just, two pieces of this pie, we can't control and prevent everything with food. So that's why I say that food isn't medicine. It can have a huge impact on your health, but it's not medicine. So trying to remove, I think, some of the guilt and fear and shame around food is just as important as what we're eating.
And I see so many women who still fear food at the later stages of life. And I've seen this with relatives. I've seen this with my mother, who have this idea of, not eating certain foods because they're bad, quote unquote, and restricting their way of eating, but also fasting. And you made a really good point around the fasting side of things. And, it's always a catch-22 because one study will say, oh, intermittent fasting is the best thing for you and it will do this and you'll do that. But then on the other side of things, if we're reaching a certain point in life where it's just going to cause more stress, why are we still doing this? Like, why are we living this restrictive lifestyle? And I'd love your input around this because I can sense the passion around this.
About fasting in particular?
Well,
how much time do we have?
Oh, well, we have enough time.
Yeah. So
majority around the fasting and also the rules around restricting foods.
Yeah. So first, I always start by saying that I completely understand and empathize and have compassion for wanting to find an easy way of eating that does all the things that we want it to, right? We all would love to wave that magic wand. And the research around fasting has really changed from, 10 or 15 years ago. There was some interest in fasting, I would say almost more primarily on a deeper cellular metabolic longevity kind of, research track. But it morphed quickly into, hey, this is an easy, and I'm using air quotes, easy way to set a rule for people around when they can eat. And the novelty of being able to eat whatever you want just within this certain time frame, I think really appeals to people, especially people who have dieted their whole lives, who have tried to follow all the different permutations of rules that, kind of go through this lather, rinse, repeat cycle. But what has happened over the last 10 or 15 years is that the research, which we've been able to do on larger groups of people, more diverse groups of people, and more tightly controlled conditions, is that fasting doesn't really do anything better than any other diet, meaning that it's a way for people to control their caloric intake, and that it works for a short period of time, generally a few weeks to a few months. But that if we look at people who are doing it for longer periods of time, a year, 2 years or more, there's very few of those studies, we find that it's not really any better. But a couple of things have started to come out of that other research. One, there may be actually some metabolic side effects of weight cycling that we know now. So weight cycling is kind of yo-yo dieting. It's the scientific term for yo-yo dieting. And so if somebody is doing fasting and it's their 15th diet and they've lost and gained the same amount of weight over and over and over again, that may actually have a negative effect on their metabolic health and their cardiometabolic health. What I see on the relationship with food side of things is that people who never identified it as binge eaters often have developed binge-like eating behaviors because they only eat during this window. So they now literally watch the clock and they count down until the start of the eating window. They prioritize eating over everything else, whether they're hungry or not, and will continue eating until the end of their window, whether they're hungry or not. So fasting for many people has taught them to ignore their hunger cues, to eat according to the clock, to eat because they can, and doesn't leave them any further ahead. Now, there are always going to be exceptions. And whenever I say this, somebody's very quick to say, oh, but it works for me. Great. I am never going to tell someone that their lived experience in their body is wrong or untrue. What I'm saying is somebody who works with, people all the time who have dieted their whole life, or even just like the last few years as they've entered perimenopause, and as somebody who regularly looks at the research, there's nothing magical about fasting. It's not going to help you live longer. It's probably not going to help you lose weight. And if you didn't have a disordered relationship with food going into it, there's a good chance you're going to come out with some thoughts and feelings and behaviors that aren't going to serve you moving forward.
It's like that old saying, there's no magic pill to fix all your problems, and definitely intermittent fasting isn't. And as you mentioned, and I love the way you explained it as well, because too often people are predicting this fasting gap just because of what the time says, but they're not actually in tune with their own natural body clock to actually eat and enjoy the food.
Yeah. And there's also research looking at cortisol levels around fasting. And, if we ignore hunger cues, and hunger is somewhat individual. Like, there are some people who are hungry the minute their feet hit the floor. I'm one of those people. There are some people like my husband who have no interest in breakfast. Like, actually, it makes him feel sick to eat within the first hour or two of eating. And if his day gets busy and started, he can 100% just forget to eat in the morning. I cannot understand what that is like. So I think that for some people, fasting may feel a bit more natural to them because of their natural rhythms and clocks. But for people like me, if I ignore my hunger, I get hangry, my energy tanks, my mood is affected. I'm thinking about food all the time, because that's what happens when our body sends the message that, hey, our reserves are running low, we'd like a refueling, please, and we don't respond to that, then the body responds by increasing our interest in food, increasing our appetite, so that we're interested in eating things that maybe we don't even like, right? And so if we want to think about what do we know about food and pleasure and eating, if we enjoy what we're eating and if it's pleasurable while we eat it, we'll want to do it again, right? If we're eating under stressful conditions because we've waited 2 hours to eat, or we can only eat in this window, that is not going to register as a pleasurable experience. And so recognizing that we have to make decisions about food every single day of our life, multiple times a day, often for other people, it can't be perfect. We can't expect to follow food rules every day with any degree of perfection. It just can't happen.
And this is where it leads us to that whole dieting culture, because dieting has, taught us to restrict certain foods, have this labeling of good and bad, and, predominantly makes us even thinking, well, it makes us have a poor relationship with food, which then hence with all the issues that come up with perimenopause and menopause around nutrition. Would you say that the nutrition, as you explained prior, needs to be monitored differently once you hit into your stages of menopause?
Yes and no. So the good news is that the basics of healthy eating don't change. What we're really doing is we're adding in. We're trying to think a little bit more intentionally around protein. So protein needs do appear to go up a little bit for all adults as we get older, right? So men and women. But especially when we're looking at how do we age well? How do we support the aging process? And I'm not talking about anti-aging, because we're all aging and we can't change that. I'm really talking about how can I still be strong enough to carry my groceries when I'm 80? That is, we want to have more protein because it helps not only to build and maintain muscle, which is important for, strength and preventing that age-related loss of muscle, but also for protecting our bones. So when we're thinking about osteoporosis and osteopenia as we get into our 60s, 70s, and 80s, protein intake is one of the things that we can do to kind of help reduce the risk of developing that age-related bone loss as well. So for a lot of people, protein is something that they've only ever associated with dieting, right? And so lots of people are like, oh, I hate protein, because all they've ever done is think about trying to get like 3,000 grams of it. I'm being facetious, obviously. But, when I tell people like, you know what, let's lower the bar a little bit. Stop trying to get 200 grams of protein a day. Let's really bring it back down to like 25 or 30 per meal. Let's start and see how you feel. Is that filling? Is that satisfying? Is it doable? Do you find that you have more energy? Do you want to do more activity and joyful movement because you've added in this source of protein that helps to stabilize your blood sugar and your energy? How is your mood? So really taking it down to like, what is practical, what is realistic, and what can you do for the rest of your life imperfectly is often the goal. I do focus on fiber a lot because when we get into postmenopause, especially that drop in estrogen increases our risk of, or I should say, brings our risk of cardiovascular disease a little bit more in line with kind of our aged match males, as it were. And so we want to be thinking about things like cholesterol, blood sugar, how do we kind of support that, but also just looking at reducing the risk of basically every cancer. Fiber comes out on top. So I'm a big fan of intuitive eating's add-in philosophy. So it's always, how can I add more plants to my plate? Because plants contain fiber. And so if we can add more plants to our plate more often and increase our fiber, that's also going to serve our long-term health goals. So those would be a couple examples of, we might make some tweaks. We might start to add in a few more things, but we're not making dramatic changes.
So simply put, it's not as hard as people make it sound to be, but people usually exaggerate about the fact of, changing their lifestyle, changing the nutrition habits. And I love the way that you were able to just tone it back down, going, okay, well, instead of overthinking about the protein quantity, how about you start eating the foods and proteins that you do enjoy and implementing that throughout the day. And I find that balancing your blood sugar levels are so important, whether you're in menopause, perimenopause, or just living life. It just, you notice a drastic change in your mood and energy once you're able to retain that over the days.
Yeah, we did a protein challenge in my membership community the other month. And this was really, the challenge was just, let's try and include protein at most meals in ways that we enjoy, whatever that is for you, and really just trying to be intentional about having it more often without putting like a number target on it even. And that was really consistently what people came back with and said. He was like, I really noticed that my energy was more stable over the course of the day. I felt more satisfied. So, we often think about protein with satisfaction, and that totally matters, but it needs to be paired with carbohydrate, right? So you can't be satisfied with just protein, but if you have a good serving of protein along with a carbohydrate, then that really refills your battery in a satisfying way and keeps you fuller for longer. So again, kind of building those very unsexy balanced plates can do some pretty great things on a day-to-day basis and really have a positive impact on how we feel living in our bodies.
It's so important to have that awareness of just changing that tiny bit in your nutrition makes a big, big difference. I'd love for us to finish today's conversation around you debunking some myths around
Sure.
menopause.
Okay. Love to. Do you have any in mind, or would you like me to just kind of
none?
Okay. Well, I think that on the nutrition side, the biggest one is that carbohydrates need to be avoided. This is one that, is regularly makes its way around. And it really comes from this fear of insulin. So carbohydrates raise insulin, and if that happens, it causes weight gain. So debunking that, insulin is a satiety hormone. It helps us to feel full. It also helps to get the nutrition into our cells so that they can produce the energy that we need to do the things that we want to do. And that carbohydrate intake is not the cause of weight change. So, and when we fear carbohydrates, it makes it harder to get enough fiber because all carbohydrates really come from plants and plants are the primary source of fiber. But also we rely on it. Our brain and our red blood cells, so the things that help us move and think, rely on glucose primarily from carbohydrates for fuel. So if you want to give your brain its preferred fuel source, so if you're in midlife and you're experiencing brain fog and you're having a hard time focusing, concentrating, staying, paying attention to things, and you're trying to do keto or low carb, then maybe it's time to rethink that. So because there really is no evidence that we need to fear or avoid carbohydrates. So that's one myth that I love talking about. Second myth that comes up a lot is around soy. So there's so much misinformation about soy, a lot of it based on old animal petri dish research that, because it's estrogenic, that it increases the risk of cancers, especially breast cancer, or that it causes feminization in men, and like all of these things that we know not to be true. And we have so much data for that. The safety around soy is really, there's no question about it anymore. It does not cause cancer. And in fact, there's quite a bit of research to suggest that it may actually reduce the risk of many cancers, including the hormone sensitive cancers. So we're primarily talking about foods. So eat soy, edamame, soy milk, soybeans, tofu, beans, lentils. All of those foods are not going to have a negative effect on your health and will likely have a positive effect. And the third one, I think, is just that is around the aging conversation. So there's so much fear around postmenopause as being like the end. But as someone who is here now and has connected with so many others in this postmenopause state, it really is just another season, and it's exciting to be at the start of a new season of life. Postmenopause is so much better than early perimenopause. So anybody who's in that stage and thinking, oh my God, I hope this doesn't get worse. It gets better. It gets way better. And it's a stage of life that I'm excited for. And I think that so many others who get to the stage realize that for lots of life reasons, we have more time and space to do things. Kids getting older, careers are established. There are also some challenges of being this sandwich generation with aging parents and younger kids. But there's such an opportunity to really see this as another season that we get to enjoy. And if we can quiet the food rules, if we can quiet all of the conversations that we're having in our head and our hearts about our bodies not being good enough and about needing to change our body, and really just live in the body that we have and treat it with kindness and respect, there is so much to look forward to.
I admire that so much, because too often people, predominantly women who speak about perimenopause and menopause, they make it sound as if it's like the end of, their existence. And I really love the fact that we were able to finish today's conversation about having a lighter perspective around menopause, making women realize, hey, it's just another phase of your life. It may not be as expected because, again, like nothing is certain in life. So you just don't know what to predict, but it's having more of a positive outcome, more positive outcome to the season of life that you're in.
My favorite quote, and I don't know who said it, but it's menopause is the end of your period. It's not the end of you. And that really describes it perfectly. And I was happy to be done with my period. I was happy to leave that part of life behind me.
Love that. Well, there you have it, girls and ladies and women, everyone around the world listening to this. Menopause is not the end of the world. It's literally another new season to embrace. Jenn, I want to thank you again so much for jumping on the podcast with me today. And girls, if you enjoyed today's podcast, please make sure that you screenshot it, tag us at the Women's Fitness Academy. And then till next time, let's embrace these new seasons of our lives as women.
Yes. Thanks so much for having me.